In your idea of the fatal destiny, not to say fatuous, which means foolish, of all things, or of your servant will, I see it to be an evident sign of your clumsiness that you force man to do what you know he cannot do. You speak of free actions, and at the same time, you say that no action is free. Who is so mad as to command one to act freely when he has no freedom at all? It is your folly to deduce servant will and not free will from the fact that God acts in us. In truth, God acts in us so that we can act freely. He makes us able to understand, to will, and to proceed. He removes the hindrances of Satan, who is always ready to hinder us. He often enlightens our minds to understand the truth when it is proposed, and moves our hearts to want it when it is proposed. He always gives us the strength to go on. Just as all things essentially have consistency in him, so all actions essentially proceed from him. Can God not produce a new creature to whom he gives free will? An angel, for example, or the first Adam? Would it not itself say that God is at work in it? For how can you conclude that agency is a servant just because God works in us? You yourself admit that Adam was free before he sinned, and yet God was at work in him. Well then, just as Adam worked freely, so now, by removing Satan's hindrances from us, God himself makes freedom take its place in us. We still have the spirit of innate deity. Even today, God still inspires in us the soul that is a partaker of deity. And that is why Paul says that all men are of divine race. With the natural light, God himself today enlightened every man that cometh into the world, with a divine light innate in every man. Through sin, man did not become a stumbling block to such an extent that God could not give him a free soul. Take the example of Christ in all this. Did Christ have a free will because God was at work in him? God worked in him, but Christ worked freely. We too in our own way. God does everything to us, and yet we are his cooperators. There are various kinds of causes, and if predestination makes you doubt free will, look at the case of Christ. All his acts were predestined by God. Did he therefore have a servant's free will? You say it is a sign of humility to become like a log and an empty gourd. But look at the case of Christ. If that is humility, it was more than a log and a plant that he humbled himself in such a way. You deny that works profit us for glory, but look at the case of Christ. They profited him greatly. He was exalted to the greatest sublimity for having spontaneously lowered himself and given himself to death, given us an example so that following in his footsteps in martyrdom, we may have greater glory. Is not the glory of the martyr greater than that of the one who is mute, who is silent? Otherwise, in vain would the martyrs be given those palms and those special insignia of glory. In vain would be the exhortations, the punishments, and the rewards. Will not he who keeps his virginity receive more glory? As the damned have special remorse of sorrow for each of their evil deeds, so the saved will have special joy of glory for each of their good deeds. But let us now turn our attention to the problems that are often raised about free will. First problem: did Adam by sin totally lose the image and spirit of God? This is what Moses teaches when he says that Adam begot children in his own likeness, Genesis 5, and that God forbids murder, for man is made in the image of God, Genesis 9. Paul also teaches again that the image of God is still in man, 1 Corinthians 11. If you deny the image of God on the outside of man, you must admit it on the inside. Now, that in him is the spirit of innate deity, I've already shown several times, and God himself teaches it in Genesis 2 and 6, as well as Job chapter 33 and 34, David in Psalm 103, which is 104, Solomon in Ecclesiasticus 12, Isaiah in chapters 42 and 47, and in many others. Authentic philosophers and theologians affirm that divinity is grafted into the human mind, and that the soul of man is homoousion, consubstantial with God. Another problem: can man do something good without the gift of grace? He distinguishes a double gift. There is an innate gift, common to all by God's creation, which grows freely. There is a superior gift, the gift of the regeneration of the new Spirit of Christ. Without the first, it is obvious that men can do nothing, but without the second, they can do some things well. Difficulted because of this misunderstanding, neither Pelagius nor Augustine understood themselves, nor is there anyone among you who understands either of them. The Spirit of God is innate to all, which is a gift that grows in each one by grace and works good in all, even in the heathen, but does not lead to the kingdom of Christ without a new grace from him. By that innate deity we work freely, and God works in us, and we can cooperate with him. But much more sublimely we work, and God works in us by the second. Another, did God foresee before he destined? Did he predestine this one because he foresaw that he would live godly, and reprove that one because he foresaw that he would live evil? What we say is that all these acts are simultaneous in God, and that none of them is the cause of the other. By foreseeing he predestinates, and by predestinating he foresees. He always acts justly and freely bestows his gifts. He chooses by grace and not by works. From these principles you will be able to answer in the same way to all the questions in which the idea of predestination drags you to admit, this your servant will. The knowledge and will of God are by their very nature prior to our acts. That is why they are called foreknowledge, predestination, foreordination. But that does not mean that they are fatalistic about the future, for there is no future for God. This is how he wants it, and that is how he gives it to us, a free will within certain limits. You insist that we no longer do anything after he has decreed something be so, but in saying this you are already supposing time in God. Just as your valour, a theologian I suppose, you measure God with your mind and tie your hands, as if his limits depended on time. I admit that we can do nothing in some things for which he denies us power, but we can in those things which he wills us to be able, and we act freely in those things which he gives us to act freely. God suffereth us not to be tempted above that we are able to resist. 1 Corinthians 10. In the moment of temptation, God puts us in a situation of power, not of suffocation. Power is one thing, and destiny is another. To such an extent does God give us power that Solomon goes so far as to say that it is in the power of man the dispositions of the heart, Proverbs 16. And John, that by his grace he gave men power to become sons of God, John 1. And Paul, that we have liberty to enter into the most holy place, Hebrews 10. You seem to think that man is a ram, a lamb, a sheep, by not considering him endowed with some trace of God's freedom. Is it not the glory of the Creator that such a beautiful feature of his freedom shines in some way in the creature, in his creature? The more so because of the same deity and mind shines in man. If you compare the corruption of Adam with the sublimity of the kingdom of Christ, you say that the former was subject to death in us and infected by the depravity of the flesh in such a way that we necessarily go to hell, that there is no free will in our power that we can do anything in regards to the kingdom of Christ, for it cannot be attained by man without a new special grace. But though God chooses us as the potter chooses the clay, it does not follow that man is only clay or stone, and that he does nothing freely. You have been deceived by this simile, which is not perfect, from the fact that in some external acts there are many circumstances subject to necessary causes apart from all human power. But however great the power of the stars may be, Isaiah 40 and Job 38, it does not follow that the mind has no free will. You are trying to show that our agency is a servant by that which is written, that we can of ourselves do nothing while the hour is not yet come, as it is said of Christ in John 2, 7 and 8. But do not forget that we are also taught not to fear the world, knowing that there is a limit to the power of man, and that also we are the beloved of God. Moreover, that hour of Christ was not of necessity, but of opportunity, since he did have power. And this is what your Augustine teaches against you in his treatise in Joanam 8 and 37. In short, this is what you must think. God willed that by the innate virtue of his creative breath that there should be some things under the power of man, and some things not. The same limitation he imposed on the angels, As to the first part of that sentence, if you attend to it, you will rightly say that those who are condemned in the last judgment will have sinned freely and will be justly punished. In regard to the heavenly vocation, you will also rightly say, as Paul does, that in regard to it we can do nothing. For to know Christ is not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that showeth mercy. It is mere election, the work of predestination alone, of liberation alone, of free gift alone. This is what Paul's whole discussion is about when he speaks of the vocation to Christ, which is beyond all human power. Since it cannot be attributed to the dominion of man, it must rightly be attributed to predestination. By the innate breath of God, we are all given to will the good in general, but not to will the Christ, which is the peculiar gift of predestination. In order to point out us the way, which is quite impossible for man, the gospel gives us some instances of predestination. Therefore, Luke aptly says that those who have believed are those who have been ordained to eternal life. This number is certain and present to God, beyond which no one is added, and yet those who come to him and believe, freely believe by divine grace. Thou thyself grantest me that of the angels, that from eternity there was a definite, predestined, and ordained number of good angels, and that nevertheless they all acted freely. The angels also acted by divine grace, but with freedom. Far more sublime is the wisdom of God in all this than you think. If Adam had remained in his first innocence, even he could not have attained this heavenly kingdom of Christ without some new grace. Would he therefore have had a servant's free will? Adam did not become a stone through sin, without the image of God and the breath of the divine mind remaining in him. You think that you have no breath of deity in your nature, as if God did not breathe into your nostrils with his breath. In the cursed Cain himself and in the giants, by the breath of deity, which has been in them from their origin, there remains some free power and some dominion over sin, according to God. So too there remains in you, unless you endeavour to make yourself a stone or a log.